The Rockies have been great. Baseball is back. What could be better? Now let me introduce our guest. This is his book. We've been friends a long time. He's been to the Forum many times, City Club of San Diego many times. He's extraordinary. And when I say that I think he is America's most prophetic voice on issues of social justice, that's exactly what I mean. People who have the values he has are not exactly popular in the corridors of power. It is one of the saving graces of the President of the United States that he understands the value of our guest, frequently has him to the White House for consultation. It's not always that he follows his advice, although he should, but he listens, which is an important thing. He has a wife, Joy, who was the first, or one of the first women ordained into the Church of England. He has two great sons, Luke and Jack, both superb baseball players. Luke may actually play for the Red Sox one day. He's a great friend. He's one of our heroes. Mark that down. He's one of our heroes, Jim Wallis.
Well, it's good to be with you all. George doesn't always tell the truth, very kind words. He once showed up at Luke's practice. I coached Luke's team, or I did before he moved way beyond me. Now I coach Jack's. And I had like 10-year-old kids, and he shows up at practice. He told them he was a Red Sox scout. And they played really well that day. They really did. I am blessed to be here and back at the Denver Forum. Let's stick with baseball a little bit to start with. George wearing his 42 pin. He gave me one, but it's in the other jacket. I put this other jacket on, so it's in my other jacket. But did you see you saw the film, right? Some of you? Jackie Robinson, 42. There's this scene in the film where things aren't going well for Jackie at all. And he says to Branch Rickey, Harrison Ford, he says, why'd you do this? Why'd you bring me here? And it's been very painful, the events of the last several days and weeks for Jackie. Why'd you bring me here? And Harrison Ford, Branch Rickey, says, well, we ended fascism in Europe, so I thought it's time to end racism in this country. Jackie says, come on, that's not an answer. Why did you bring me here? And so the great baseball man sits down with a cigar and he says, I love baseball. I'd give my life to this game. But when I saw they wouldn't let the greatest players from the Negro League play in the major leagues, I knew something was wrong at the heart of baseball. And that's why I brought you here. Jackie says, thank you. But Branch Rickey says, no. Thank you. You're allowing me to love baseball again. And when I heard that, I thought of so many things. I thought of the church. Things so wrong at the heart of the church for those of us who are from, and sometimes it's hard to love the church with all the things wrong at the heart of it. Or public life, politics. Congressman here. I have friends in the Congress, and sometimes these days it's hard to love our public life. And I went away to write this book. I took a sabbatical to write this book at my board's suggestion. It was a good suggestion. And my discipline was to not speak or write or be interviewed about politics or the political narrative during the first 3 months of the election year, which was a tough discipline for me, but I did. And every morning I would get up early and I would have some quiet and then some exercise, and I'd read and write all day. But I watched the news cycle at night. the more disengaged I was, and the more I watched, the more depressing it really felt. The polarization, the paralyzation, the fear, the anger, the hatred, the vitriol, the shallowness in media and politics, and the continued crisis. I'm back and forth on the phone this morning because it looks like we had bipartisan immigration reform, first thing, only thing we're going to get from this Congress for months and months, and even that now, something just happened this morning about that. So I'm on this book tour, going around 18 cities in about 6 weeks, and every time, like last night, the tattered cover here in San Francisco, before that, Minneapolis tomorrow, the room fills with people who come into the room. They come, I guess, because because of the first line of this book. They have this hunger for this. Our life together can be better. They're hungry for that. They wouldn't come if they weren't hungry for that. But they're cynical, really cynical, about Washington, about Wall Street, about the church, they're cynical, and it takes an hour or more in conversation to almost spiritually minister to that cynicism and to explain that skepticism is a good and healthy thing. Asking hard questions is a good and healthy thing, but cynicism is a spiritually dangerous thing because cynicism is the buffer against personal commitment. Things aren't going to change, so I can pull back and take care of my security. And what only changes history is personal commitments. So I was in Birmingham, Alabama 3 weeks ago with your colleague and my dear friend, John Lewis. We were there for the 50th anniversary of the release of the letter from a Birmingham jail from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was, so it's realized it had been 50 years and there was never a response from the white churches in 50 years to that letter. So CCT, Christian Church Together, that's all of our denominations, we put a response together and we had a big meeting in Birmingham. And so John and I got to address the opening session of that symposium. And I love John Lewis. He's the only politician that I've ever wanted my baby taken a picture of with. Only one. And Luke, when he was a baby, his picture's still in my office. John Lewis holding Luke as a baby. Only one I've ever done that for. But we talked about Birmingham and how there was brutal segregation in Birmingham. And then Bull Connor sicked his dogs and his clubs on children in the street. And then they put King in jail, and then the ministers, the moderate ministers, blamed King for making trouble, for all this protest, for just stirring things up. And he's in jail. So his letter is a response to the letter from the clergy, none of whom we remember today, but we remember King. And the letter was wonderful. It was an appeal to people of goodwill, despite what they had said and done. It was about reason, analyzing the situation, and it was really about love and forgiveness, even in response to what they had said. It's a classic piece of literature which I would recommend you read on the 50th anniversary. But then we got talking about what changed things, and John was in Birmingham, but he was also in Selma. When King got back from getting his Nobel Peace Prize, John and I recounted the story to this group of church leaders. He went first to the White House, not to Atlanta, his home, but to see Lyndon Johnson. And he said, Mr. President, now that we have a civil rights law, which is why he got the Nobel Peace Prize for the success of Birmingham and the civil rights law, now we need a Voting Rights Act. And the master of realpolitik, Lyndon Johnson, said to the nation's moral leader, "I can't do that for you. I've cashed in all my chits with the Southern senators. It'll take 5 years or 10 years before I can give you a Voting Rights Act." But we can't wait 5 years, says King. We won't even be able to enforce civil rights law if we can't vote in the South. We have to get our voting rights. Johnson, who wanted to do it, said, "I just can't do it. It's not politically possible." So King was not one to whine or complain or withdraw out of cynicism. He went out to organize in a place called, no one heard of, called Selma, Alabama. And John Lewis marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what became called Bloody Sunday as a 23-year-old kid and got beaten almost to death by Jim Clark and his thugs, the police. And then the clergy around the country were ignited. I was in Chicago with Martin Marty just this 2 weeks ago, famous theologian. Martin Marty went down. Abraham Joshua Heschel went down. Clergy went down, and they marched with King from Selma to Montgomery. The whole nation focused its attention on this march, and we had voting rights in 5 months. Not 5 years, 5 months. King had changed the context. But John Lewis was almost beaten to death. Now he's a member of Congress. And you know how John is, he said, my parents always told me to not get in the way. Well, I learned you gotta get in the way, gotta get in the way. You gotta move with your feet, get in the way. And he got in the way. So, I'm saying in this book that the common good comes last to Washington, D.C. Comes last. It comes first when ordinary people make decisions about their lives, their households, their parenting, their congregations, their workplaces, their neighborhoods, their schools, and their nation, and that creates social movements which only change politics. Politics only change because of social movements. So this book is about how, when I was watching this news every night, I realized how much we had lost this fundamental ancient idea called the common good. It goes back centuries. I found this wonderful quote right off the bat. It says, "This is the rule of the most perfect Christianity, its most exact definition, its highest point, namely the seeking of the common good. For nothing can so make a person an imitator of Christ as caring for his neighbors." John Chrysostom, 347 to 407, early church father. The foundation for this common good idea is the second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, which is in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. It's also in our secular democratic tradition, so the common good is not limited to religion. This is a conversation we can have across the board, nor even the politics. Mike Gerson, who was Bush's speechwriter, now a good friend of mine, says kindly in the back of the book, "Jim Wallis and I have a variety of differences, even on domestic and international policy, but there is no message more timely or urgent than his call to actively consider the common good." As a congressman can tell you, that's just not what they do in Washington. It's just not what they do. They want to make us afraid of a problem and blame it on the other side and keep campaigning. On immigration reform, I'm going to be very blunt today because I just had this call. Immigration reform, Republicans and Democrats looked me in the eye and they said, "We normally would do this in a way that would help us win the next election." I'm being honest, they said. But on this, we're going to do what is necessary to find a bipartisan bill to protect those 11 million people that you in the faith community are so concerned about. And they're hoping that they're sometimes almost giddy. This could, first time we're being positive and bipartisan. They're hoping we could maybe affect other things. Now, I didn't know who was going to be here today, but Congressman Skaggs and I have been on the phone before. We remembered that. And I write about a letter in this book that he and his colleagues helped to write, former members of Congress, 2010, trying to find some common ground, and about civility. About 130 former members of Congress, Republican, Democrat, released a letter urging civility. And it says this: "None of us shrank from partisan debates while in Congress, or from the partisan contests getting there. During our time in Congress, partisans on the other side may have been our opponents on some bills and our adversaries on some issues. They were not, however, the enemy. Adversaries, rigorous debate, absolutely. That's what democracy is. The enemy? No. Evil? No. Members of Congress are in fear of their lives. They tell me that. I'm working on the gym one day. I see in the news a friend I'd been with the week before had been shot in the head, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. We have got a serious problem with the common good. And so I try in the book to say, how do we re-inspire that again? So this is the most biblical, theological book I've written for some time. And I'll take the text. If you say you love God, whom you haven't seen, and then you say, and you don't love your neighbor who you have seen, sometimes even when they are fellow members of your own religion or church, you are a liar. He didn't misquote that. That's what it says. So what does it mean in these rooms we're having? People walk out of these rooms often after an hour and a half, and they're feeling, they tell me, inspired to go back and do something, make choices, decisions. But they're up against a political world that is controlled by well-funded extremes. The checks have replaced all the balances in our public life, completely. Senator John Kerry, who's now Secretary of State, once told me he had to raise $20,000 every day on average to get reelected, every day. Who do you talk to? Whose calls do you take? So I try to take the common good and try to apply it to things like redeeming democracy. Democracy, which we all celebrate, and we should, I do too, began with a bunch of white landed men claiming their right to vote. That's what we celebrate. That's who it was. Eventually it was all men, landed or not. After a whole lot of social movement, white women got included. But not until 1965 did African Americans get the right to vote. And then now, I was at Nelson Mandela's inauguration, and Desmond Tutu's a mentor, and all that. And all around the world now, democracy is rising. But do we really think in this country that we have one person, one vote? Does anybody really believe that? When primary candidates literally are viable because of one donor or two? There are 3 pharmaceutical lobbyists for every single member of Congress. 3, that's one industry. I'll tell you, there aren't many lobbyists for low-income families and moms and kids. But that voice is now being heard in Washington, D.C., and the faith community is trying to pull that voice together, and the book tells about how that's happening on immigration, even on the budget. We had a meeting with the president, debt crisis, a year and a half ago, and his team was all there, and so was ours, including the Catholic bishops, all the mainline churches, the National Association of Evangelicals, Salvation Army. It's hardly a religious left group. And the Catholic bishop said to the president, he says, Mr. President, the text that obliges us to be here, that compels our obedience, does not say, as you've done to the middle class, you've done to me. It says, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. In Matthew 25, the president said, I know that text. I said, I know you do. Now, you can't reduce a deficit by increasing poverty. I've got members of the Gang of 8, Senate, friends of mine, I was in their office one day, I said, Senator, you and I could pick the 12 senators who could find a path to fiscal security. I believe in fiscal sustainability. I don't want to shackle my kids with debt the rest of their lives. Fiscal sustainability is a moral issue. How you do it is also a moral issue. We could find the senators, I said senator, who could do this and still protect our principle in the faith community, a circle of protection around the poorest and most vulnerable. We could do that too, right? He says, yes, we could. But then the interests would come into the room and demand their expenditures, would they not? He says, yes, they would. And the poor would be compromised, would they not? Yes, they will. That's called redeeming democracy that we have to do. Or the economy. Let's call it the uneconomy. Unfair, unsustainable, unstable, and making a lot of people unhappy. Now, I say that as somebody who's the co-chair with Mike Gerson of the Values Action Council for the World Economic Forum in Davos. I'm not talking about just Occupy Wall Street. I was there, talked to the kids, but 3 days later I'm with the World Economic Forum, and the same questions are on the table. The same questions. We've got broken social contracts. People have lost their trust in this economy and how decisions are made and where they're made. Unless we establish trust again, we'll be in serious trouble. The income stats have just out now. From 2009, 2011, the top 7% of the country increased their wealth during the crisis time by 28%. 2009, 2011. The bottom 93% lost 4% in the same period. This crisis of confidence is not good for business. And so my friends at Davos, CEOs, tell me that when your only metric is quarterly profit and loss statements for shareholders, we are in serious trouble. Klaus Schwab, who began Davos, Austrian economist, clearly a capitalist. Klaus, for years, has been saying it can't be just shareholders, it must be stakeholders. A broader group of stakeholders, customers, workers, the environment. Indigenous people around here say things like you decide decisions today based on their impact on the 7th generation out. That's a different metric than profit, quarterly, shareholder metrics. Our metrics are wrong. How do we change our metrics? And we have a new social covenant going around the world, put forward by CEOs, NGOs, and it says there are 3 values we have to maintain: individual dignity, the common good, and this wonderful notion of stewardship for the planet and the posterity. So there are people who want to change that. The role of government. This is always a wonderful Washington question. It's too big, too small. Big and small are the wrong questions. What is the role, the purpose, the vocation of government from both our scriptures and our democratic traditions? That's not being discussed in Washington. I think we could find some common ground on that. I'm one who believes in finding common ground for the common good. And immigration is one place it's happening. There are other places. I'm making a list on this tour of what other issues people think we can find to find common ground for the common good. There's a long chapter here on households, and probably because I'm a dad and a Little League baseball coach, I'm more and more thinking the decisions we make in our households with those closest to us, particularly with our kids, may do more for the common good than even what we do outside of our household. So here's a little baseball story to finish up, and we'll open this up. So my son Jack, I'm missing 2 games on this little tour, hardest part of the tour. But they played last night, and it doesn't matter, but they won 8-0. It doesn't matter, but they won 8-0. So, but the team was only 9 last year in a 9-10-year league, and they were the youngest team, and we lost the first 4 games, not surprising. 5th game, we're down. 5th inning, down 5. Top of the order has gone up and out, nothing. Here comes the bottom of the order. And due to no fault of their own, 2 kids got on base. I mean, the pitches were so high they couldn't even jump and swing at them. And so they walked, and they're on base. Up walks Stefan, who's the worst player on the team because his parents are internationals, Washington, D.C. He hasn't got a clue what he's doing, what this game is about. He's just up there at the plate holding this thing called a bat. He doesn't know what he's doing, but somehow the ball hits the bat. And it's in center field. And 2 runs score. And Stefan is there on second base. Now, he's a Brit, so he's very polite. And he sees this kid over at shortstop. And he walks off to shake hands with him. And so I yell, "Stefan, you gotta stay on the base." And he says, "Oh, I've never been here before." That began the rally. We won 11-5. I gave Stefan the game ball. He was thrilled. And after games, we have these post-game meetings to discuss what we learned about life today in baseball. And so here's what I heard, and this is relevant to our topic. One kid said, "Sometimes what you need comes from unexpected places." Next kid said, "We were all necessary for this game today, for this win. It took all of us to win this game today, all of us." Third kid says, my star player, he says, "It just goes to show you, you can never give up on hope." You can never give up on hope. The civil rights movement succeeded not just because of Selma and Birmingham, because millions of people in their lives, their congregations, their workplaces, their schools, their family life made choices, made decisions that made a civil rights movement work. And that's what this book in a small way is trying to do again. And it gets to the question of who is our neighbor. You know, when we only take care of ourselves, our group, our tribe, our party, just us, our nation, we'll all be in trouble. All be in serious trouble. When we take care of each other and extend the notion of neighbor beyond our group, ourselves, our party, at that point, the common good becomes possible. And I'll give you one example. I was in D.C. and the issue was the Congo, and you know the Congo, the minerals issue, the minerals that make our cell phones. The profits are going to warlords who are taking the money to buy weapons and pillage civilians, women and children. So I got all these CEOs and NGOs, and I'm the religious lunch speaker, which means I got to inspire them over their bad sandwiches, you know. So they're all sitting there trying to eat, and I said, "Okay, take out your cell phones." I said, "No, really, take them out," and they did. And I said, This is your significant other. You spend more time with this now than probably anybody, anything else during the course of a day." And in San Diego the other night, this woman, she says, "It's your husband." "That's you, dear, that's you," she said. You know? So I said, and I read the story to them of the Good Samaritan, which was a secular crowd, but they've all heard that story. And it was a lawyer asking Jesus a question. Now, the lawyer who asked Jesus the question, what you don't know, is he was a Washington lawyer. I can tell the tone of voice. It wasn't, "Who is my neighbor? I'd like to help." It was, "So who's my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? I want to avoid taking responsibility." Jesus says, "Well, there was a story, this guy, side of the road, he's hurt. The religious leader's passing by, and somebody who's a different race, ethnic group, stranger, he stopped to help a stranger." That's what I mean by being a neighbor. So I'll just ask us all, do we know who our neighbors are? I mean, literally, immediately who our neighbors are, who's around our life every day, and are we involved with them? Do we know who our poor neighbors are? And if you don't, I know Denver, they're not very far away from us right here, who our poor neighbors are. And they're making minerals, they produce cell phones. So I said to the CEOs, whoever helped make your cell phone, whose ever lives were impacted by your cell phone, that's your neighbor, globally now. So I said, let's talk about turning supply chains into value chains. And they stopped eating and we had a great conversation. I'm in conversation with business folks about supply chains. Bangladesh, we just lost 700 people now with the collapse of a clothing factory. That's a moral indictment on how our clothing industry is functioning. Supply chains, value chains. Poor neighbor. I'm on a book tour. I'm in hotel rooms. Undocumented neighbors clean my room every night. Undocumented neighbors. Who's your gay neighbor? Who's outside your group? Who's your Muslim neighbor? Tell stories in the book. There's a mosque burn in Missouri. All the young people in my office and out there put up signs 2 blocks away. Love your Muslim neighbor. Simple reminder of a couple of things. New York subway system, hateful stuff about Muslims. Signs went up. Love your Muslim neighbor. Who is our neighbor? That's the question. That's the common good. And finally, social movements are what change things. So I'll end with another biblical quote, since you started with one. Hebrews says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." My best paraphrase of that is, hope means believing in spite of the evidence, and then watching the evidence change. There isn't much evidence for hope these days in Washington, D.C. But I think there's a hunger in the country, particularly among a younger generation, for the common good. People who want to live their lives for that. And I want to help build that movement and ask how that common good movement can even someday change politics. Thank you very much.
We have time for some dialogue. I do want to acknowledge Meg Sweezy, who's here from Indianapolis. She's with DMX, and no, she's actually with LexisNexis and Aaron Holloman. So we met her last night. She's terrific. We hope she'll come back. And Jim Kennel is going to be transitioning, and we will appropriately honor him at that time. Who would like to ask the first question, make the first comment? Mr. Hart, and then over here.
Jim, I loved you when you were here last time, and I loved you again today, as I think many of us did. Thank you. What is the root cause of the dysfunction you spoke about? And if it's the special interest money in politics, what can we do individually and collectively to fix it?
Congressman Skaggs was here. I was hoping he could stay with us and answer that question. Come up. They worked hard, really hard, on this Common Ground group, and we had them on a phone call with a bunch of faith leaders, and you could tell how concerned they were and how discouraged they were. There used to be these bipartisan retreats in Washington, but people used to know they used to know each other's spouses and kids and, Little League. Like, I coached Northwest Little League, and one of the other big dad coaches, big Northwest guy, is the chief economist for the American Enterprise, for AEI. And I've been debating his boss around the country, Arthur Brooks, and we've gotten to know each other, like each other. But I've co-coached with this guy, and on economics, we would have different views. But we're really good friends, and we have a very civil discourse, and that has disappeared in Washington. So part of it is a social context, lack of relationship, lack of proximity, but a lot of it's money. Three things: the local lack of social relations. Money is controlling everything now in Washington. I've got this wonderful quote from Abraham Lincoln: "My concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is to be on God's side." We bring God onto our side in religion and politics and the absolute certainty. The best religion doesn't produce the deepest certainty, it produces the deepest reflection. So Lincoln flips the question. Don't ask if God's on your side, ask what it means to be on God's side. Lincoln didn't always know. He wrestled with God. It was a flipping the question, and it was offering a kind of humility. And asking that question, or what is the common good, it acknowledges that we see through a glass darkly, as Paul says in Corinthians. And that kind of the hubris and the pride and the ideology and the certainty. And I would add to that a media culture that no longer hardly covers anything, but just entertains and propagandizes. Mike Gerson and I have talked about this. People get their news from sources that fuel their already existing prejudices. And when I was on sabbatical watching the news, I could flip from Fox to MSNBC, and the content would be different, but the style and tone is remarkably, painfully similar. Like on Boston came up during this tour. The coverage in Boston has been extensive and utterly shallow. Who did it and how can we get them? That's the coverage. What about something like this? How do we understand real and imagined grievances interacting with religious fundamentalism, political extremism, emotional instability, sometimes mental illness, and let's add adolescent male rage? Let's have that conversation about how to make this world safer. I didn't hear any of that. So money, lack of social relationships, money, and a media culture which is polarizing and dividing us every day. And the people on the Hill are afraid of the media pundits. They're literally afraid. I have a good friend, Republican, conservative Republican, and he called me one day, and he was about to be primaried in his district because in a meeting, one of his constituents was just attacking Barack Obama at a very personal level, and he says, wait a minute, I disagree with the president, but I don't feel that's fair or true. I disagree with him on everything, but that's not, he's a patriot, he loves this country, he's not a Muslim, he's a Christian, I know that. Why are you so afraid? And she said, have you listened to Glenn Beck lately? And he said, stop listening to Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck put him on, focused on him. I've been on Glenn Beck's blackboard as well. And that cost him the election. People are afraid of media pundits in Washington. Those three things.
Next, and then the last question here.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that a congressman referred to you as a member of the faith-based community. And we've spent the last 50 years kind of empowering groups and celebrating groups over individuals. Isn't that effort empowering groups, doesn't that weaken the common good?
Empowering groups?
And identity among groups?
Well, it's a good question. Martin King, Dr. King, my mentor, he never said, I get to win because I'm a Christian in a Judeo-Christian country. He never said that. He said, I have to win the debate about the common good. He can invoke Jesus, Jeremiah, whatever, but he had to win the debate. So that's what I want to foster, that conversation about the common good. I think we're getting hit by both ends of the political cycle. Let me say, on the right, and Mike Gerson writes about this in the Washington Post today, there is a kind of an extreme libertarian politics on the Republican side, which says there really is no even legitimate concept of the common good. Everything is all about individuals. E.J. Dionne, who's been here before, his latest book talks about two traditions in American life, individuality and community. And when they're in balance, we're good. When they're not, we're in trouble. And so there's, on the right, there is this extreme libertarian view. Ayn Rand is very different, as she says herself, than Jesus Christ, a very different view of the world. Selfishness being a virtue is what she says. On the left, there's a kind of identity politics. My group, my constituency is more important than the common good. An identity group can see itself as more important than the common good. So how do we get the conversation focused on the common good? And I think the extremes of left and right, both well-funded, are really shaping our politics now.
That's Jim Wallis. This is a book. He'll be happy to have you buy it and sign it for you, and you shouldn't leave here without one. Thank you all for coming. Let's express our appreciation to Jim.
But just let me say, what I believe, and this book says, is that people, roomfuls of people like this, making choices in their places, contexts, workplaces, that's the only thing that can and does change the common good and finally even Washington. So thank you very much.